Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL week number 4 overview and analysis video in the summer split. Not really much to say in these intros after we've gotten a few weeks into the split. We really have a good idea of where a lot of these teams are already standing going into the week, but every game really does matter in a double round robin system, and especially with the fact that every seed kind of matters in terms of where you place going in, either in Group Ascend or Group Nirvana to the play-in stage. You really want to make sure you put your best foot forward as quickly as possible and start picking up those wins. And so every team really looking at that. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect from this week in the LPL, and did it live up to your expectations? Of course, I'm going to be going over everything I thought of the week, but if you are new here, what we're going to be doing is going series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We'll be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 14 at the end of the week, kind of talking about where I think teams are landing, whether or not I think they're getting better or worse, but most of today will be spent talking about the games themselves as per usual. Of course, small little aside as we start the video here. I, of course, am still casting for LPL English, basically every single week as a color caster. For them, we did 4 of the series that we're going to cover in today's video, so 2 of the days. We'll be doing a lot more in the rest of the split in the upcoming weeks, and so check the links to that out in the description here. Obviously, if you are interested, we've got the YouTube, we've got the Twitch down there if you want to subscribe or follow or whatever you want to do for those, and if you want to see a more in-depth breakdown, that is obviously the place to go for LPL action. If you want to watch these games, outside of the week that I cover these videos where, I only post once a week, or if you just want to see my live thoughts on the series that I am covering, that is the place for it. But all of that out of the way, the intro kind of done, let's go ahead and get into the action and the games themselves, and that starts with day number 1. Now, typically speaking, of course, there's 2 series every single day, but because of the tropical storms that are taking place, the typhoons that are taking place right now, we only had 1, with one of the other series being canceled. Our first series of the week was a matchup between Team WE and FunPlus Phoenix, where WE was able to pick up the 2-1 series win. And obviously, this is really important for them, not just because it's their first series win of the entire split, which means that they are no longer sitting at 0-5. They are now at, I believe, 1-5 after this series. Certainly a much better place to be, but because this last place spot in Group Ascend actually really matters going into the playoffs and the play-in stage. With how well LGD Gaming is looking at the top of Group Nirvana, it's pretty realistic to expect either of the teams that end up, coming out of this spot in number 8 to lose and to not make playoffs. And so you really need to make sure you can find that form as quickly as possible, and for WE, they're going to be happy to pick it up here. For FPX, their change in the jungle has not worked. In fact, I would argue this team has gotten worse in the past couple of weeks, which is never a really good place for them to be. And I've basically completely given up on thinking of them as a team that's going to be able to compete here in Group Ascend, and I'll kind of talk about why. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Taeyun down in the bot lane. I'm not going to say that Taeyun individually maybe had the most unbelievable series, the most incredible outplays that you've ever seen in your entire life, but I do think he had such a big impact on the series and on the games as a whole that it was difficult for me to go in a different direction. Really, it was just the Kai'Sa game in Game 1 where he was overextended, and even then, he was really the one that was pumping out a lot of the damage that was going in favor of WE, but the Yunara in Game 2, he was the one set up to carry that game, and the Caitlyn in Game 3 was absolutely massive. That's really the game where it felt like he completely took over, and we've seen this on specifically champions like Caitlyn before. When you let Taeyun and Vampire play for the 2v2 and start to generate leads on their own down in the bot lane, things just go a bit better for WE than when they have to rely on other pieces. That's not because I think they're the best players on the team or anything like that. Monkey very much still takes that crown despite the fact that he's making these weird mid-game mistakes. I think that they are the most relevant to actually get ahead for WE. If you get them into good spots, they can be useful. If you don't, they're quite bad. And so you really want to make sure that they get on the right side of the coin as early as possible in those games. And I think Taeyun did that. Like I said, Caitlyn was basically one-shotting people down the stretch of that third and final game. And the form is just really hard to try and predict here for Taeyun, because as a player, when it's bad, it's really bad. Like, quite frankly, most of this split, the fact that they are winless, a lot of that has to do with the fact that Taeyun has really reverted back to being what he was in the LCK when he was on the Kwangdong Freaks, where it's just like, why does this guy have a tier 1 job? What are we doing? What are we pushing for here? But there is a lot of talent in here. He's a scrim god for a reason. Everybody's talked about him as if he's a player that can step up at any given moment. I think that the hands are there, the brain is definitely not, and so it's all really about getting him into a spot where he can carry the game without having to think too much, and that's exactly what happened here. Vampire deserves some credit, I would say, for that, but I don't think this is one of Vampire's better series of the split. I think that there have been a lot of times where you could point to him even in their losses where he's playing relatively well, where he's a strength for the team. I don't know if this was one of those. There were a lot of moments where Jway was being a big proactive playmaker on the crazy set and Bard and everything like that on the other side, and Vampire was more so just along for the ride with WE, but I certainly think he was part of the reason why it felt so stable and so secure. Sometimes Vampire can just be way too aggressive, and when he gets out of his own way, he can be a very good player, but at the end of the day, Monkey is still kind of the core and the, I guess, the energy that flows through the team in terms of what they want to create on the map. He was the guy in Game 2. You can look at the Unara really starting to take over in terms of the damage as that game continues to go along, but Monkey was the one setting everything up on the Skarner. Just a great performance, and we're going to talk about it as we get further along into this, but he was way better than Milky Way as a player in this series, so, big plus to Monkey. I think him getting back on track after what was kind of a rough week last week, not that he was terrible in every game, just that he was making boneheaded mistakes. Him getting back on track was a big deal. The Maokai also very good. But I am still concerned about parts of this team. The solo laners are just not great. Cube in particular has just been terrible. Not that that should surprise anybody. He was awful last year, and I have been stunned by the fact that he's not been a complete liability so far in 2025. Maybe he is starting to get back into that zone, but the Ornn in Game 1 was terrible, and it really did feel like he was just weaker than Sheer in basically every aspect of the game. And Karis is just not a good player in the mid lane. Like, there's not really much to say. He's never been a good mid laner. Even when WE was successful, they were successful really in spite of him in the mid lane, so it all really comes down to what this team can become with their jungle and bot lane. But at least for now, that's probably not bottom 1 in Group Ascend. Like, that's a top 7-ish team in the LPL. Top 8-ish team is where I have them right now in the LPL, and I'm really not all that surprised by this outcome, as you can see from my power rankings. But for FPX on the other side of this matchup, some things to really kind of start discussing and really start bringing up. Milky Way's just not been good since coming in, and I get that we're giving him some time to maybe get his feet under him because he's coming over from RNG, and that whole that whole situation in general was just a complete disaster, and he was good on FPX last year. But don't forget what I was saying about Milky Way in the playoffs in 2024, because I was already really starting this narrative. Milky Way's kind of been found out by a majority of the league in terms of what his pathing looks like. He was a very, I guess, robotic jungler is how I would classify him coming out of last year, because there were so many moments where it just felt so cookie cutter in terms of his pathing, and his pathing was unique and it was creative, but he was doing it every game. And I think once teams really learned exactly what his priorities were and what his pathing was in the early game, he just did not have success. And we saw it earlier this year on RNG. He really struggled to be able to elevate the rest of a team. He can still generate resources for himself. I think he's good enough as a player to consistently be able to do that with the hands that he has and the fact that he can skirmish well. But in terms of leading a team, I'm very concerned that he just does not have that skill set in the LPL, and that what we saw from him as a rookie on FPX might have been the best possible version of Milky Way, and that it likely will never get back there again. Maybe I'm wrong about that, and I would prefer to be wrong. You guys know, I sometimes, I guess not as much anymore, but I used to really get kind of a reputation for being a hater on this channel, and I used to get called out quite a bit for being much lower on players than consensus. I think a lot of people realize that now I'm just trying to call out where I see, potential failures in players' game, and I would love to be proven wrong. I want Milky Way to succeed as a player, but right now I'm very concerned about what he looks like, and he is dud of the series here. Him getting completely outplayed is what ends up leading to FPX's demise. The Viego game had some moments. He did get some resets in some fights, but he had no tempo, and going up against something like Maokai, you have to be so proactive with Jway to be able to create things early on, because you can't just allow these front-to-backs to get Caitlyn in a good spot, and that's exactly what happened. But the Xin Zhao game in Game 2, completely unplayable from him. Like, he was horrible in that game. He looked like, an LDL caliber jungler, like somebody who got relegated at the beginning of this split, which he did. So I'm worried about Milky Way. I just don't think he's going to be an upgrade here for FPX. At the very least, I think he's not an upgrade from a stylistic perspective, which is just as much of a problem as a hands perspective. I do want to give credit to most of the rest of this team, though, because I think almost everybody else here played fine. Karis still not a superstar, but he's definitely better than Karis. On the other side, Sheer wasn't great, and I think Sheer has taken quite a few steps back. He's playing significantly worse right now than he did at the beginning of the year and last year for JD Gaming. Never really great to see backwards projection, or backwards regression, I should say, from a player like Sheer that we're kind of projecting to be good in the future, to have that kind of upside. FPX has not shown a great track record of developing players, especially young ones, on their organization as of late, so maybe Sheer is just another one of those players that ends up needing to go to another team to figure things out. Jachi and Jway, I think we're actually fine. Jway in particular is such a great playmaker. It just doesn't really matter. It's wasted here on FPX, but this team is still bad. I had them, barely top 10 in my power rankings because of that, even after the win over Invictus, and WE winning here is not particularly particularly surprising. Nobody should be shocked by the fact that WE is not the worst team in Group Ascend. Then moving on now to day number 2, because like I said, we only had one series on the first day, and kicking off day 2 was a matchup between Thunder Talk Gaming and Ninjas in Pyjamas in Group Nirvana, where Ninjas in Pyjamas are going to pick up the 2-1 series win. A bit surprising that Thunder Talk even got a game in this series, because Ninjas in Pyjamas really kind of won all 3 of these. This was a throw in game number 1 in terms of how things ended up going down, but at the end of the day, they're able to close out the series. They're able to look incredibly dominant, especially in that second game, and they're able to come out on top. For Thunder Talk, it's just not a great look. This team is so much worse than they have been at the beginning of the year. It's actually ridiculous. They're not even on the same playing field as what they were in the winter split. But, you know, we kind of expected some regression. I've always been a lot lower on this team. I criticized, you know, some broadcasts at the beginning of the year for putting Thunder Talk as a top 6 or 7 team, or projecting them to win a playoff series, you know, predicting them in that sense. I've always been a lot lower, and unfortunately, it's another case of me being right to have been a bit more pessimistic about a team. But let's go ahead and get into what happened specifically in this series. Player of the series is going to go to Nio in the jungle. There was no debate in terms of how this broke down. Pretty big jungle gap, I would say, throughout the series, but I'm not going to sit here and say that Aki was the biggest problem. I know it's a really fun narrative to talk about Aki going up against NIP, his former team that he got replaced on going into this split, but I don't think Aki was really the one that was holding Thunder Talk back in this particular series, even if he was the one that was holding Ninjas in Pyjamas back. But Nio is a clear upgrade in the jungle at this point, especially if you're just looking for somebody who can carry games. And I think this team is looking for that, because look at the construction of the rest of this roster and how they want to play a lot of these games. Leave got to play 3 hyper carries in this series, Yunara, Senna, and Smolder. Obviously, Senna a little bit different in terms of how she ends up operating, but functionally, I guess, kind of fits the idea. You have Doingbi, who wants to get out on the map and move. The Talia, the Rise. Akali, obviously much more carry-oriented, but Doingbi has always been a better player, you know, making his jungler or the rest of his team look great. So you want to carry jungler. You want someone who can come in and actually take resources and play with pressure. Aki was not that guy. He's always been better at Sejuani and Maokai than he ever has been at, you know, more aggressive picks, and we even saw that in this series. But, you know, Nio is not that. He is absolutely willing to take all the kills and to take all the resources to carry the games here, and we saw that specifically on the Pantheon in Game 2. That's most of the reason he's getting player of the series. He was still very good on the Lee Sin, I would say, in Game number 3, so I don't want to sit there and make it seem like he was a one-game wonder or anything like that, but overall, just a good performance from Nio, and continues to really step up. He has changed the culture here on Ninjas in Pyjamas and made them a much better and much scarier team. Solo Kill, I think, is starting to get back into form. He's really not been all that good, I would say, at the start of this split, but I think it is getting better right now. This was a much better showcase. Again, Hoya, not the best of competition in the entire world in terms of maybe what you're expecting, but at least he was able to pick up the win and to dominate in Game 3, specifically on the Cassante. Like I said, for Doingbi, I think he feels a lot more comfortable now that he gets to play Rise and Talia and really worry more so about the things that he's good at and worry less so about the things that he's bad at, like carrying games. The Akali was strong in Game 2, but the Rise really is what opened up the map in Game 3 alongside that Lee Sin. Leave and Niket were fine. They weren't the stars. Niket actually had a really good series, I think, in terms of his positioning, a lot of under-the-radar plays from him, but Ninjas in Pyjamas just being better than Thunder Talk. We could have expected that going into this series. It's still nice to see it, especially in the jungle position, though. And for Thunder Talk, this team has some real problems, and unfortunately for them, they also have some real solutions. They just can't really get them out as much as they want. 1xN, I think, is developing quite quickly, and I get that this is a team that just gives every single resource they have over to 1xN, but it's really become one of those things where they win Game 1 off the back of him being able to carry games, and then once the team gets taken off of their comfort zone in Fearless in Games 2 and Games 3, they just don't have enough firepower to let him carry games in the same kind of way. So poor 1xN is trying his best, and I think he's playing some of the best League of his entire career right now, but Satab is so garbage in the mid lane that it's impossible to win these games. He's done of the series. It's not particularly close. A lot of people are going to throw blame on Aki or even Feather at times for how this series broke down. Satab was unplayable throughout this, and there's no way to justify the performances that he was giving. Not to say the rest of the team was good, rather that Satab, I think at this point, has proven what we all kind of assumed going into the year, that the performances on DRX last year were not a facade. They were not a mirage in terms of how things broke down. He's just not a good mid laner. Like, he is not what he was at the beginning of the year when he was going up against Knight in a best of 5 and actually holding his own. That is not Satab, and I don't think that will be him for the rest of the split, especially now that, you know, Aki, I think, is really just a worse version of Beichuan in the jungle in terms of how things break down. Like, he is a macro, you know, facilitative-oriented player who's just not particularly mechanically talented, but he's in bad form, so it's not easy for them to win off the back of that either. Feather, I think, is so important towards whether this team can find success, and he wasn't good. Hoya got destroyed on the top side. ThunderTuck is a bottom echelon team right now, even in Group Nirvana. This could very easily be a bottom 3, even bottom 2 team that ends up missing out on play-ins if everything were to go wrong for them. I still think they have, a good shot at being able to figure things out and move forward, but they got to get their shit into gear pretty quickly because it's getting close towards, the second half of the round robin here. But nice win for Ninjas in Pyjamas. They're still in contention for that number 1 spot in Group Nirvana, despite how good Edward Gaming have been. Once you get into that second round robin, anything can happen, and they still have another matchup against that top team. So if they can keep this form up and continue to get better, this can still be a team that makes some noise and maybe even gets into playoffs. But then moving on now to our second series of day number 2, and this is a big one, at least on paper. It's a matchup between Anyone's Legend and Top Esports. And Top Esports is going to pick up the victory here, the 2-1 series victory, and AL continues to really plummet in the standings. They move from 2-2 to 2-3, which is not a great place to be, and Top Esports is really looking good at the start of this split. This gets them into first place in the standings, which is absolutely massive, and honestly, this team is clicking at a level that we had not seen them click since the beginning of the year. This is technically a finals rematch from winter. I think a lot of people forget that these two teams faced off in the finals in winter, but just like in that previous series, Top Esports the one to come out on top. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Kanavi kind of has to be player of the series. I'm not really sure I can go in any sort of different direction in terms of how these games broke down. I get it. He completely ran it in game number 2, and that's a totally valid and fair thing to say if you want to take away player of the series from me. If you want to say the Xin Zhao game was too bad that he insta-lost game 2, I think that that's entirely fair, and you're correct in that sense, but he carried game 1 on the Skarner in terms of the setups, and he super carried game 3 on the Jarvan in terms of the setups. I just can't really look any other direction. He played so well in their wins that he kind of has to be the player of the series for me. So I get that, generally speaking, I don't want to give it to a player that ends up, really running it down for a game in a series, but this is one of those big exceptions, and this really is the Kanavi experience, isn't it? Where the good games look so good and the bad games look so bad. This is just generally what we've gotten to know of Kanavi, especially on Top Esports since coming over this year, but I think the good games are so good that you have to consider him one of the scariest players to face in the entire league. This guy won MVP for the spring split. Don't forget about that. I know people are forgetting about that because things didn't go Top Esports' way in the playoffs. They super underperformed and got 5th place in the LPL, but he was the MVP for a reason because he super carried the beginning part of the year, and it really does feel like he's back into that kind of form. Him versus Tarzan was not close in this third and final game when it really mattered, and I think that that is a really glowing endorsement of where Top Esports is at right now. 369 had a very sneakily great series. I know his KDA doesn't look all that phenomenal, but I think that game 1 on the Gwen really was incredible, and I think getting them out to a starting lead was really important for them moving forward. Cream ended up getting 11 kills in game 3 on the Aurora. LPL Aurora, even Cream's Aurora in particular, has always just looked so good, and so excited to see that that continues to be a power pick, and Shanks is kind of going through some problems right now. He has not been nearly as consistent. I'm not even going to talk about the off-the-riff stuff. If you want to check that out for yourself, whatever, man. I'm not going to touch upon that. I want to say that early and often in today's video. I have absolutely no comments to make on that, but Cream, at least in terms of on-the-rift performance, just completely outplayed him, and I think that that is a concern because Cream has kind of been out of form throughout basically all of the back 2 months of this year so far. Jackie Love and Hong have been a huge upgrade down in the bot lane over what Jackie Love and Crisp were as a duo. I've talked about it a ton. Hong's not getting nearly enough credit for how good he's been, and Jackie Love has arguably been the MVP so far of the summer split. It's just kind of working right now for Top Esports. You got to hope that they're going to be able to keep it up because a good version of Top Esports is one of, if not the scariest team in the entire league. And for Anyone's Legend on the other side, this team looks so burnt out, it's actually insane. And I'm not using that as an excuse. I'm not trying to sit here and say that it's the schedule or that it's whatever, this or that ends up with them being burnt out. But this is not even close to the same team that we saw throughout the beginning part of the year in terms of how they are playing the map and how they are playing the game just in general. And I think that really, really showcases itself with Tarzan in the jungle, who's going to get yet another dud of the series. I'm not going to try and make any sort of gigantic hyperbolic statements here, but you guys know I do track some statistics outside of the main ones that are getting tracked. I track my own personal stats that I like to keep a little bit hidden on the channel just for certain purposes. But, Tarzan, I will give a glimpse into it, is currently grading out as maybe the worst player in the LPL in terms of what he has shown tape-wise so far in the summer split. It's been terrible. Like, in the wins, he's been good. He's not been the main guy. In their wins, I would say Hope and, Shanks and Flandra have really stepped up in a lot of their wins. But in their losses, he is consistently making gigantic mistakes. And I get the Maokai has never really been Tarzan's forte. It's one of the few facilitators he's never felt all that comfortable on, but this was a terrible Maokai game. He got super jungle gapped in game 3, and he wasn't great in game 1 on the Pantheon either, what a lot of people consider to be the strongest jungler in the game, especially in the LPL right now. So true concerns coming in from Tarzan. He has started this split about as poorly as you possibly can, and if he doesn't get back on track, then AL is not going to get back on track. He is the player that drives the bus for AL, and if he's not going to start playing well, it's kind of doomed for them. And that's with everybody else, I think, generally being fine. Shanks was completely outplayed by Cream in game number 3, but I thought Shanks was pretty good before that, especially on the Orianna. Flandra was generally fine, kind of playing his tanks that he plays every single series on the top side. I hate Yorick in this current meta, but he continues to pick it. And Hope and KL were still fine on the bot side. Hope actually had a great series in terms of his performance. He carried game 2 on the Kai'Sa, so there are, you know, redeeming qualities for AL, but if Tarzan is going to continue to be a net negative for this team and really kind of turn back on the form that we've seen from him throughout every year of his career up until this point, that's going to be a major concern for me with anyone's legend. And for top esports, Kanavi is back in form, even if that form is incredibly inconsistent, because it's Kanavi. You just have to learn to live with it when it comes to him as a player, but when top esports are clicking, they are incredibly scary to go into. But then moving on now to day number 3, and we kick day 3 off with a matchup between JD Gaming and Bilibili Gaming, and BLG are going to pick up the 2-1 series win here. They're going to remain undefeated so far in the summer split. They obviously had a later start than everybody else, coming back from EWC and from MSI and just all of those international tournaments that they had to play, and they were bringing in a new jungler in Shadow to try and upgrade this team, and so everything's kind of been in flux for Bilibili, but it's definitely working out at the current moment. Undefeated obviously goes to prove that. The honeymoon phase continuing onwards. This team, I believe, is 5-0 now to kick off the split, about as good as you could ask for. For JD Gaming, it's basically the entire opposite story. This team was thriving at the end of the regular season in the spring split, and it really felt like they would be a team that could compete to go to MSI to represent the LPL. They completely fall apart in the playoffs. They underperform just about as much as any team could possibly underperform, not winning a single playoff series, and they've started out here in summer looking atrocious in terms of what this team looks like, despite some of the changes even being okay here for them in terms of their roster moves. So we'll go ahead and talk about it, but starting with BLG's side, as we always do here with the winning side, player of the series for me is going to go to Bin on the top side. Yorick Gaming, baby. This was a Yorick destruction game in game number 3. Now, I really debated on who to give player of the series to between Bin and Shadow, because I think both of them were very good here in this win, but we're going to talk more about the jungle gap in a negative light for Shun on the other side in terms of how things ended up going. Bin being able to pick up the gigantic advantage on the top side had less to do with his opponent, because Xiaoxu was actually really good in this series. Bin was more so just better, right, in terms of how things broke down. The Renekton in game 2, and again, specifically that Yorick in game 3, really opened everything up for BLG throughout this entire series, and you gotta give Bin credit. He has really gotten back into form coming back to the LPL. There's been some question marks about whether or not he has started to fall off in terms of his performances at the beginning of the year, but as I've reminded people pretty consistently over the course of this year, Bin has never really been a guy outside of last year where he's actually played well in the regular season. This is pretty normal for Bin to underperform for a majority of the year, start trying towards the end, and actually start to pick up his tempo again. I think that is what we are seeing here. You know, York's not a particularly strong champion right now from my perspective after the nerfs, but Bim certainly making it look completely busted. But like I said, Shadow was also really good for this team, and I just want to continue to reiterate the points that I've been making on Shadow because, you know, I think my takes on him have aged relatively well. This is kind of the perfect combo, I think, of what this team has been looking for. Not to say that this is anything more than a honeymoon phase, because with Wei and with Beichuan, they also continued to go undefeated for a little bit before things started to fall apart. So, you know, I'm holding my breath on whether or not this will be sustainable for Shadow. But the thing I really like about the fit here is they've constantly been looking for this macro presence that can be more of a facilitator coming out of the jungle, but somebody that definitely has the tools to be able to skirmish, somebody who is an early game facilitator, if you will. And I think the problem with Wei is that he was too slow and wanted to play for the late game. He can carry games, but isn't necessarily there to do it through skirmishing. And so players like On and Knight, who wanted to be aggressive, had to play a lot more slow. And then for Beichuan, while he did have the macro sense that they were looking for, he did not have the mechanics to really back up being on a team like BLG. And when he went up against really good junglers, you could see him kind of get exploited in a lot of those fights. Shadow has good mechanics, and I think he's the kind of player that doesn't need a ton of resources in order to be useful, can pick things like Sejuani and can find a lot of success in that regard, but is a skirmisher because he is more of an aggressive-minded player. I think it's a good fit here on BLG, and I think we continue to see the team really reap the rewards of his good play and his great shot calling from what we've heard in terms of how this team is talking about him. Knight has continued to start off the split hot. This guy has not been bad throughout any part of this year. I think that there was maybe like a 3-week stretch at the beginning of spring where you could talk about some of those negative moments bleeding through, but this guy still almost won MVP despite the team being a disaster at the beginning of the spring split. That's how good he was, and I think he's still in ridiculous form. He's the best player in the LPL. I still don't think that's particularly disputable. He played Azir and Orianna, 2 champions that the community memes that he can't win on, and he absolutely gapped everybody on stage on it, so great. You know, Elk and On, I think, are very much back in form. I've been an on defender, I think, in terms of his tape throughout a lot of this year, but Elk, I think, is definitely starting to step back up. Overall, for BLG, I've just really liked the way that they've been playing the game. Are there things that I would want them to clean up? Absolutely, but losing a game to JDG is not the end of the world because they're able to pull it back. And for JDG on the other side, everything is kind of falling apart for this team. Let's be honest, they are not very good. I think Group Ascend is really exploiting just how beatable JDG is. There's no longer these free teams at the bottom of Group Ascend. You are clearly outside of the top 5, and while there might be WE and FPX to beat up on, there's no Thunder Talk, there's no Ninjas in Pyjamas. You don't get 4 of these opponents, you only get 2 of them in Group Ascend right now, and I think we're really starting to see the problems there. We can talk about the positives first. I think Xiaoxiu has been really good on the top side for JDG. I think he's genuinely just been a positive overall for them. You know, there were moments in week 3 where I was like, you know, maybe weeks 1 and 2 were a bit more of an outlier with him getting that honeymoon phase himself over on his new team, but this was another really good showing. I think he was really solid in this series. And Pays, I think he actually had one of his better performances of the entire split in this one, but more so kind of the Pays that we saw throughout a lot of the spring split, in that he himself is playing really well and the rest of the team is not living up to it, because Scout and Shun are just not good enough right now. Shun is going to get done of the series. We've already talked at length about Scout and his underperformances. He's been terrible so far to start this split, and he needs to really figure things out. But Shun, he's kind of been the stabilizer. He has, for the most part, been the second best player on this team throughout all of this year, and that did not showcase itself here. He was whiffing impales on the Skarner in Game 2. His engages on Vi in Game 3 were absolutely terrible. You know, a lot of really bad moments. He got jungle gapped by Shadow, and I think he really wanted to showcase that he could be better than his former team here in BLG, who has consistently been trying to look for someone to fill his shoes. Well, Shadow might be that guy, because Shun was not even close to on his level in this series. Wink has also just not been very good. Missing was very bad in the spring split, but Wink has definitely not been an upgrade in the support position, and with, you know, everything going on with LGD Gaming and Palkia right now for that team, it's certainly looking like EDG even upgraded letting Wink go. So not a great look for him as a support. It's just not clicking for JDG. I think it might eventually get there, but honestly, I'm not holding my breath. We've seen some teams go through some underperformances and figure it out, but I need to see it on the Rift, because right now this team looks very, very lost. And for Bilibili, they're certainly good enough to be the #1 team in the LPL. We all thought they were going to be going into the year. They've just not lived up to that own expectation that they set for themselves. It feels like they're closer to that right now than they have been at any point. And I know I've been a BLG defender even in spring split, but this might actually be the magic formula that gets them back to the top. Then moving on to series number 2 of day number 3, and it's yet another very consequential outcome as we saw Anyone's Legend taking on Invictus Gaming, and Invictus Gaming is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. They don't drop a single game to the defending champions, who moved to 2-4 to start off their split here in the LPL. Things are collapsing for AL, and I think you've run out of excuses when it comes to their form in terms of, oh, you know, they're tired, they're, you know, just out of form, they're going to be able to pick things up. They had their chance to pick things up. They did in week 3. It felt like they figured things out when they went 2-0. It felt like they were playing a lot better. Tarzan even got on the player of the week leaderboard, even though I thought that was pretty ridiculous, all things considered. And now Invictus kind of proving, after another showcase from AL, that they are absolutely the kind of team that has to be taken seriously at the top of the ladder. This could be a top 3 team right now in the LPL, and I think that that's a pretty fair thing to say. They didn't even need the one player that I think has been playing the best out of this team in Rookie the entire split to step up here today. They got all of it and all of what they needed from their bot lane, who really just were superstars on the day. Gala and Mako playing about as well as we've seen them play all year long against AL. Mako is going to be the one that I personally give player of the series, but man, it's up to you, like, who you want to give it to. They were both absolutely phenomenal. Both of them deserve it. Gala ends up getting a pentakill in this series, and Mako obviously sets basically everything up for IG and for Gala throughout all of it, but this was a bot lane masterclass, going up against Hope and KL, who have been the best and most consistent bot lane in the LPL. For them to have such a good performance on Yunara, on Senna, on these late game carries that are really starting to emerge as the meta in the summer split, it's a really good sign, because the big concern for me when it's come to Gala so far this split, in the games that he has actively lost for Invictus, all come down to this idea that he's not been a great team fighter for the team, that he's not been great at stepping up in these 5v5s. Well, here you go. Here is a 5v5 masterclass coming in from Gala on Yunara, on Senna, and, you know, obviously Mako really kind of getting back into form. I've been heavily critical of Mako throughout this entire year, especially going into the spring split. Like, this was a guy where I was just talking down on over and over again because I had such high expectations coming off of that top esports year last year where he was absolutely phenomenal, where I would have made the case he was the best support in the world. He's really not even been close across this year. He's kind of been an active negative for the team. This is the kind of Mako that needs to show up throughout the rest of the year. If he can do that, this team can be a world's contender. They are good enough to win the LPL from a talent perspective, especially if you are getting that top tier bot lane, and they definitely got it here in this one. But like I said, you didn't even really need, like, the main carries. Wei and Rookie have been kind of the main characters. I wouldn't necessarily say the best players, although Rookie's been the best player on this team. I will very happily say that. He's been excellent so far throughout the summer split, but he wasn't really all that great in this series, or at the very least, he didn't need to step up and be kind of the main character. Wei has had his ups and downs. He's had some terrible moments, like against FPX, and he's had some really good moments, like most of their wins, where he has actually looked pretty solid as a jungler, but they didn't need him today. The Shy was good on the top side, was definitely better than Flandra, and like I said, the bot lane basically 2v8'd throughout this entire game. Not that they needed to, because the rest of IG was good, but they definitely did. So credit to IG, credit to the bot lane. Happy to see that. And for AL, it is collapsing. It is kind of crumbling around them right now. All of the momentum and all of the success that they found throughout this year, it does not seem like it's going to be sustainable at the current moment. And I have to point in a couple of very specific directions. First and foremost, Flandra is dud of the series. I don't think he's the problem on this team right now. I think it's more of a byproduct of why the team is not working, that Flandra ended up having such a poor performance here on the Scion and on the Ambessa in game number 2, but when I'm talking about the actual problem, like, you know, when you take a look out at, like, the full picture of AL, when you look at, like, the grand scheme of things, what is the issue? This team can't win if Tarzan's not carrying. Like, that is absolutely looking like it's the case right now. I like Shanks and Hope and KL and Flandra, but I think it's clear that this team was really elevated by the fact that Tarzan was playing like the best jungler in the world, and he's not anywhere close to that kind of form right now, and that turns them from a team that wins the LPL and is the most consistent in the league by a large margin to a team that just doesn't really have anything going for them at an exceptional level. Like, as much as these players are talented, Tarzan was the piece that was putting them over the top, and it's clear that if he is just going to be fine as a jungler, even below average as a jungler like he has been throughout this split, this team is going to completely fall apart. And I get the narrative of, like, oh, well, then put the blame on Tarzan. Trust me, I am. I think Tarzan has been the worst player on this team so far this split, but I think even more so than that, it is clear that no one else on this team can step up and elevate AL to being elite in the absence of Tarzan like a lot of other great teams can. Like, you can't have a week or two where Tarzan underperforms because this team doesn't have anyone else that can really stabilize in that particular situation. So not looking good for AL, to be quite frank. I'm very concerned about this team. Now, Hope is a very good player, and I still think he's in great form. I even think Shanks' mechanics were a little bit better in this series. His laning was very solid on things like the Talia and the Aurora. It just didn't matter. There was no pressure and tempo coming out of the jungle, and like I said, if Tarzan's not going to play well, this team will continue to plummet in the standings. But for Invictus, this is another massive win. All I need to see from them at this point is that this is not something that's just going to go away when it matters the most. They got third last split in the playoffs, and I think people forget that because they were so up and down in the regular season. This is a team that's actually on a very positive trajectory right now and really looks poised to not only make some noise here in the LPL, but potentially make Worlds as well. Then moving on now to day number 4, our middle day of LPL action this week, and we kicked off day 4 with a matchup between LNG Esports and LGD Gaming, and LNG are going to pick up the 2-0 win, their first of the entire split here. WE breaks their winless record. LNG breaks their winless record this week. It feels like everybody's just trying to get their revenge as we go throughout week number 4, but they make a substitution in the support position. Zhuo is out. We will talk about him a bit more later on in the week, but OVO is in, and honestly, this team looked completely reinvigorated with a more aggressive support coming in to kind of change things up. I still think they lack mechanics and just general talent in a lot of key areas, but they played really well in this series. And LGD, this is kind of a frustrating loss. This team really felt like they were on the cusp of becoming one of the top 3 in Group Nirvana. They've always been able to overperform in Group Nirvana, and these lower pressure environments, you know, even with the talent level that they've had over the past couple of years, they've been able to figure things out, but this was not a good movement in that direction. So we'll go ahead and talk about it, starting with player of the series, which is going to go to Zika on the top side. How could it go to anyone else in this series? First and foremost, I'll just quickly get into it. This was a top gap. This was not particularly close, and you know, with the way that these two had been playing over the past couple of weeks, it is a bit surprising to kind of see it go this way, because Sasa has actually been really good for LGD. He's been one of, if not the biggest strength, I would say, for this team across this split so far. YCX has kind of been up there as well, but Sasa, I think, has been really good, and Zika has really felt mentally checked out. Like, we're never worried about the talent level of a player like Zika, because we've seen what he can do at the top end level. He can be a top 5-ish top laner in the LPL, and he might still be a top 5-ish top laner in terms of his actual production, but it's just hard to see that because the team is so bad around him, and in the past couple series, we've kind of seen him stop carrying, and honestly, I don't really blame him. This is a scenario and a circumstance I likely would have also stopped carrying in, but he showed up for this series and showcased why Group Nirvana is not worthy of his own talents. It's crazy that no Group Ascend team went and picked him up in the offseason to get him on a team trying to make Worlds, because this is what this guy can do when he does get to run over games. On Rumble, on Renekton, it did not matter. Across both of these games, he was so much better than everybody else that he was going into. It was actually ridiculous. So credit to Zika really showcasing that, you know, upper tier talent that he does have as an individual player. And it wasn't just him. Again, it was the rest of the team as well. Xiaofeng has had, you know, good moments, bad moments. Climber has not really put up a ton of resistance. I think we saw better things out of Climber at the end of last week. You know, there were some questions in the first couple series, but it felt like he was getting on the right track, and then he runs into Xiaofeng, and once again, things start to fall apart a bit for LGD. Xiaofeng is a really good player at being able to push early game tempo and snowballing games out of control, but he's your stereotypical modern jungler in the sense that he's bad at playing from behind, as basically everyone is, but he's not very good at being able to stabilize games, and if you allow him to get out of control, it's a free win, which is what he got in this one. OVO, like I said, was a very big upgrade, I would say, in the support position, just in terms of mentality. He actually was looking for plays. He actually was looking to be a true playmaker for the team, which Zhuo basically had given up on, so that looks solid. Now, Fish One, a player that obviously they bring OVO up because he has that synergy with Fish One. They played in the LDL throughout the entirety of this year in LNG's LDL team, but Fish One is not very good. I think we saw some moments on the Jinx. We saw one good team fight, and that's enough for me to hang my hat on. Okay, yeah, he's better than Photic and LP because those players didn't even get the chance to show one good team fight, but at the end of the day, I still need to see a lot more coming out of the AD carry role, even if support does feel upgraded. Haichao, also a player that I'm not fully believing in. I'm not trying to say this is the LNG turnaround, that they're all of a sudden going to figure things out and get top 4 in this group, because I still think the odds are against them, but this is an important win for them to get to still establish themselves in that conversation and to not make it nearly impossible for them to be there. And for LGD, they really needed this win. I had considered them a top 3 team in Group Nirvana, you know, over the past couple of weeks, and this was not the performance of a top 3 team. It wasn't even particularly close. They just got outplayed everywhere across the map. Sasa is the obvious choice for Dead of the series because he was completely useless throughout this entire series. The Mbessa in game 1 did not work into the Rumble, and you can't be picking Yorick if you are not confidently the better player in your own lane, and if you cannot confidently play the rest of the map incredibly strong, because Sasa looked unplayable on this Yorick, and again, that champion has been nerfed so much it's not particularly surprising, but he has been the standout positive player for LGD. For him to falter here, it's not surprising because of how good Zika is, but it is a bit disappointing. The rest of the team, I think, was also not great here. Savior and YCX, I think, had some really bad performances. I've been a bit lower on what this bot lane is because I think people are starting to hype up some Group Nirvana performances just a tad bit over maybe what I'm willing to buy in on, but they certainly should be better than Fish One and OVO. That is absolutely true. And Climber and Xiaoqinghua in the mid lane, they also absolutely should be better than their opposition. Climber, I think, was really starting to figure things out at the end of week 3, like I said, but this is not a good response to that. And as much as I don't like Xiaoqinghua, he's not been the worst mid laner, which I think has been shocking because Haichao has been so bad. This might put Xiaoqinghua back into that bottom 1 category, that number 14 mid laner type of category, because, you know, I'm not a fan of either of these two mid laners, and Haichao ended up winning on the day. But, you know, it's one of those things where LGD should have been good enough to stabilize, especially with the form that they were in, and it just didn't happen. Disappointing stuff from them, but an important win for LNG. It keeps their hopes alive. They were looking pretty dire. This team was, on a fast track to potentially go winless throughout the entirety of the split. For them to pick up a win here against not even like an Ultra Prime or a Thunder Talk that's really struggling, but an LGD team that actually had been figuring out some of the things they were looking towards. It's a nice win, and it seems like a good roster change for them in the support position. But then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and if this one looks familiar, it's because we've already gone over these two teams facing off against each other this week in this video. It's Thunder Talk Gaming taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas, and once again, it's an NIP 2-1 series win. They just continue to show that same consistency that they've become accustomed to, and honestly, with, the second round robin starting across week number 4 here, us really getting into the back half, we are going to see even more repeat matchups as we go throughout the rest of this week, but not really a lot to talk about that is all that different from the first matchup between these two teams. I still think a lot of the narratives that I ended up laying out for both of them ended up coming true, and there wasn't really a lot of different, gameplay, I'll say, going on between them throughout this one. So, might be a bit of a quicker overview considering we already did this, but player of the series is going to change. Instead of it being Nio in this one, it is going to go to Doingbi in the mid lane. He was the better player in this series. He was the best player in this series. I think that was very easy to see in terms of the gameplay, not just in their wins, but even in their loss in game number 1, I thought he was doing a lot of good things on the Talia to open up the map a bit more. I've really wanted to see what he can look like, really feeling a bit more unlocked now that he has a carry jungler. We talked about how that fits stylistically for Nio in particular and how they can get the most out of him, but, we briefly glanced on the idea of how much that just gets out of Doingbi and how much that opens him up to be able to really be a lot more aggressive in lane and to feel comfortable trying to take a lot of these skirmishes in the early game. The things he did when he was playing like one of the best players in the world, when he was winning worlds. That's the kind of player that you want to get here, obviously, as the franchise guy for Ninjas in Pyjamas, and I think you got that in this series in particular. The Victor, the Rise, this is probably the best that Doingbi has played so far this split, and I think that is a really good sign. And other positives continue to be the jungle position. Nio, it's not like him not getting player of the series means that he played worse in this one. He definitely still was way better than Aki and proves himself to be a pretty big upgrade over him in the jungle position, but it doesn't have to be him. It doesn't have to be Nio that gets all the resources and carries games. It can be other pieces of this team. Now, solo kill I don't think was nearly as effective for NIP in this series as he was the first time he went and played Hoya, but it's still solo kill. He's still better than Hoya. I'm not worrying about him too much. Leave and Niket continue to just kind of be fine. I think in both of these series, it's fair to say that 1XM was the best player in the bot lane. I don't think it's all that controversial to put that statement out in terms of, how both of these, 3-game sets ended up going, but Leave and Niket are still fine. I'm just not nearly as high on these two players as everybody else seems to be. The talent is there. I think the execution and the production definitely need to follow at some point, but really not a lot of negative to talk about here for NIP. You could at times say, okay, well, they beat Thunder Talk twice, who really cares? But they still beat them twice. They still ended up going 4-2 across these 6 games, which is good enough. For Thunder Talk, man, their flaws are so obvious. This team is really bad in a couple of key areas. Their bot lane is strong, and Feather, while he does make mistakes and is overly aggressive at times, is still positive, especially when 1XN can really start to get going on a hyper carry, but that's it, right? Thunder Talk only win when this guy gets to play something like Yunara, like he did in game number 1. He gets the ball and he ends up completely, rolling over Ninjas in Pyjamas in that game. It's the exact same as what we talked about in game 1 of the previous series. He did it on Xayah in that particular game. Obviously didn't have nearly as much success on the Xayah in game number 2, but it's 1XN being able to carry them to victories. He is making small mistakes in their losses, but generally it's just, okay, is he able to carry the game? Yes, then they can win. They can beat anybody. Okay, is he getting demolished? Okay, this team is getting, crushed. There's no way for them to be able to win. He is that important towards their win condition, but it's the middle of the map that I think is really starting to tear things apart for Thunder Talk. Aki and Satab are just not clicking. Satab is terrible. I get every single post-match comment on this one was, oh, Aki lost them the series. Oh, Aki lost the breakup, whatever, all of this stuff because he's going against his former team. I don't know how you can look at this series and blame Aki and not Satab, who is just unplayable in the mid lane. The gap between these two players, the gap between Satab and Doingbi is so ginormous that it's almost impossible for me to evaluate this game and see anything other than mid lane dominance coming in from Ninjas in Pyjamas. And so Obviously, that is an issue. Satab at this point, probably somebody that needs to be looked at getting benched. He was not good on DRX in the LCK, and he's been not good for Thunder Talk. He's fallen off quite a bit, and that promise he showed in the Challengers League is just not coming across. So, need to see more from Satab, or I need to see him kind of get out of here, because Thunder Talk is actually sneakily in danger of not making plans after being a team that was in Group Ascend last split. Aki obviously didn't perform great, but he wasn't the problem on this team. He certainly wasn't the only problem on this team. I don't think it's fair to talk about him as the biggest issue. Hoya was also better, I would say, than the first series, but, you know, he picked Aurora in Game 3. I don't want to see Hoya on Aurora. I want to see this guy on tanks every single game. That's the sweet spot for Thunder Talk. So this team's not very good, but they did lose to one of the better teams in Group Nirvana twice. We'll have to see how they rebound later on in the week. And for Ninjas in Pyjamas, obviously 2 wins this week is solid, but Thunder Talk have not really shown themselves to be particularly dangerous. It's really just about what this team can do now that they're fighting for the #1 spot in Group Nirvana. Then moving on now to day number 5, and this is the first of 2 days that I got to cast towards the back half of this week, which means these should be at least a little bit quicker in terms of the overviews, and we certainly got a banger to kick off the casting spree here for me. It was Ultra Prime taking on LNG Esports, and Ultra Prime picks up the 2-1 series win, but this one was far from just being a blowout in one direction or the other. LNG end up really dominating Game 1, only for Ultra Prime to strike back in that second game, and Game 3 is a complete fiesta. It's, you know, play after play. It's mistake after mistake. It's everything you want out of a Group Nirvana matchup between likely the 2 worst teams in the entire league. Both of them refusing to win and throwing away every advantage and opportunity they have at their own disposal. Obviously, very fun gameplay, but not quite the best to analyze in terms of trying to break down the good and the bad, but there's certainly something to take away for both of these teams. So let's go ahead and get into it. Player of the series, at least for me, is going to go to Jung on the top side. I really do think you have to give it to him in terms of the consistency throughout the entire series. As good as Baez, you know, KDA ends up looking, and even Fish 1, like their KDAs look fine here. Holy cow, was this a game of throws from the 2 AD carries. Baya making one of the largest mistakes I've ever seen, a game-losing mistake in the mid lane, getting caught towards the end of game number 3. Should have given over Elder. It didn't end up giving over Elder because Junhao, who had been killed at the beginning of a fight around the Elder Drake, respawns with just enough time to be able to get back in and steal it. And as he's stealing it, Baya comes up and, you know, comes back alive, so he gets the Elder buff. LNG obviously end up wiping the fight because Ultra Prime are in such a bad spot, but they can't end because of the Elder executes. They end up losing the game off the back of that play itself. It's a crazy ending. You know, if you haven't seen it, again, go check it out. But yeah, I can't give Baya player of the series. That's essentially what I'm saying. There's no way he was ever going to be on the menu for this award. So Jung is going to get it on the top side, and he really was great in their 2 wins. The Mbessa, the Cassante, I think both of those games were phenomenal. The Mbessa in particular in game 2, he really was taking over, and in that third and final game, he had a couple of really big plays and honestly was just incredibly unkillable on the Cassante towards the back half, as that champion tends to become. So really, really like the way that he ended up playing it out, and honestly, Jung is showing a lot more in this final split in 2025 than he did in the first couple, which is good development. You want to see a player get better. You don't necessarily feel good about a player who maybe shows a lot in their first split and never gets to that next level. You'd rather see that consistent growth, and I think Jung is starting to show it. As for the rest of the team, you know, not as many positive things to say. I think Saber had a pretty bad series, all things considered, even on the Akali in Game 3. Junhao had the gigantic steal onto the Elder in Game 3 that ended up really sealing the game for Ultra Prime, but outside of that, made a ton of mistakes throughout the rest of the series. Like I said, Baya had some good moments, and he had some terrible moments, some individual game-losing moments that did not end up coming back to bite Ultra Prime. Absolutely would have come back to bite better teams, and Xiaoxia was a player that was generally fine. When this guy dies less than like 10 times throughout a series, Ultra Prime are pretty much guaranteed to win no matter what else happens on the map. I highlighted that in the pre-show, but overall, it's an important win for Ultra Prime, even if it's not a clean one, because it does get them one step closer, and in fact, I do think it gets them into 4th place in terms of the standings, which is, of course, the play-in spots. But for LNG, this was kind of a battle for not being last place, and you lost it, and that's really not a good sign. I get that it was a banger, and it was kind of close, and there were some moments where you could look back in a positive direction for LNG, but for the most part, this team did not play well across the day, and I think that really lands square on Haichao for me. I'm not saying he's the only player to play bad. I certainly don't want to come across like I'm trying to just shit on his gameplay, because I think his Annie game was honestly pretty fine in game number 1. Had a lot of really nice setups, but the Aurora and the Silas, 2 very aggressive picks coming out in games 2 and 3, and neither of them doing anything throughout the back half of the series, I think really ended up coming back to bite LNG. Same thing for Fish One, who obviously ends up being the new AD carry here for LNG. Man, is this guy just not very good. Like, there's nothing left to see, I think, out of him. I think we're kind of concluding that, maybe he is a slight upgrade over LP and Fodic, but even then, I'm not even sure that that's the case. This looks like a lateral move or even a downgrade because this guy is just not a very good AD carry, despite what the KDA would indicate. OVO, I think, definitely took a step back from what he was in that first series. Maybe the magic wore off a bit. The honeymoon phase coming to an end in the second series is not necessarily ideal. And as much as I do like Xiaofeng and even Zika on the top side, and Zika, by the way, played really well, I think, throughout a lot of this series. If he landed a couple of more keeper's verdicts on the Poppy, maybe things change, but overall, like, even with the top side being okay, the top side for Ultra Prime was better. Like, Jung was better than Zika, even if Zika was solid in this series. So LNG really feeling like the bottom of the barrel, and it really does feel like their win over LGD earlier on in the week was more of a mirage and more of a tempting thing to kind of see what this team could be rather than what they actually are. And for Ultra Prime, this is obviously a huge win. It gets you into 4th place. You're still fighting it out to be a team that can at least try to make playoffs. Bare minimum, you don't want to be bottom 2. You don't want to be a team that misses out on a play-in series. And so for Ultra Prime, this is a great win to help them get there. Then moving on to our second series of day number 5, and this one was, at times fun to cast, and at times very much not fun to cast. It was Anyone's Legend taking on FunPlus Phoenix, and AL ends up picking up the 2-1 series victory, but as much as this is a 2-1 series win, none of these games were interesting, really, at all. Game 2 certainly came the closest to being something that was worth watching for an audience, but really, Game 1 was an FPX domination. It's really only fun if you were cheering against AL and for FPX in this series, and Game 3, FPX don't even get a single kill. It's 15-0 at the end, a near perfect game from Anyone's Legend. Really incredible stuff from them. They finally feel like they're starting to turn something around, but at the end of the day, they dropped a game to FPX, and that's not something this team would have done in the spring split. As much as I'd love to sit here and say they picked up a dominant win, this is the worst team in the entire group that they are facing, and they still had to drop a game against them to come back and win. So there are still concerns here, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series kind of has to go to Tarzan because he was the one making the most plays, I would say, throughout this. The Poppy in particular in Game 2, I think, really created a lot of the action for Anyone's Legend. The Xin Zhao in Game 3, maybe undeservedly getting the player of the game on the broadcast, as we pointed out, but still, particularly good performance overall from Tarzan, and they need this. Man, it is night and day what the difference is between when Tarzan is performing well and when he's not for this team. And I know, again, that's obvious. There's going to be a lot of people that leave a comment that are like, oh, every team, when their jungler plays well, they win. When their jungler doesn't play well, they lose. I get that, right? Like, I get the idea that it's just generally how things go. If your team plays well, you win. I get it. But, like, Tarzan especially, like, the rest of this team can only function if Tarzan has pressure. And so if he's going to be able to generate that in the jungle, if he's going to especially be better than his opposition, in this case Milky Way, it's going to be just fine for AL, despite who they're going up against. It's not been consistent this split, but at least it was okay in this particular series. Shanks, I thought, was really good in Game 3. Obviously, definitely not touching upon any of this stuff. I didn't touch upon it on broadcast. I'm not going to touch upon it here, but I will say the Orianna shockwaves were absolutely massive. Likely my player of the game for that third game because I think he really needed to step up, and I think he did. Hope and KL in the bot lane were fine. Again, I think Hope has continued to be really good. I don't think he's making any mistakes. I think his positioning is really solid. I just think the general effort from the team around him has gotten worse, which makes it harder to win. Flandra was also fine, I would say, on the top side. Sheer was a nightmare in that third and final game on the Jackson, was kind of a disaster throughout a lot of this series, so I don't want to overhype how Flandra ended up playing, but against his former teammate in Sheer, ended up looking good. AL needed this win. They got a much-needed win and a victory here, but for FPX on the other side, they're trying to get out of the bottom of Group Ascend, and this is not a good way to do so. You need good performances out of your bot lane, and I just don't think Jiachi ended up giving you that in this series. He's going to get dud of the series for me, specifically for this Corki game. In Game 2, he was in such a prime position to try and take over. Honestly, that game was pretty close, and there were a lot of avenues to play off of Kair's aggressiveness on the Aurora and all the gold that you were able to get on Corki in the early game, and it just didn't happen. His positioning was too bad. He ended up being way too short range to ever really impact the fight against a Victor and a Sivir in the way that he needed to in game number 2, and I think that really did cost them the series because they had no chance in Game 3. If you want to blame Kair for Game 3 on the Sylas and talk about how terrible he was, that's perfectly fine. Everyone was terrible in Game 3, and while Kair was especially awful, it's hard for me to say dud of the series should go to someone for that third game where everyone played bad rather than the second game where part of the team played well and then one player ended up really kind of costing FPX FPX a lot of chances to win. So Jhachi ends up getting that dud of the series moniker. But Milky Way, I need to continue to berate the point. This guy's gotta, step up at some point. They looked better with IYY than they do with Milky Way. I don't even think that's really all that debatable. This team has not shown any life or any fire with Milky Way in the jungle position, and specifically Milky Way has just not looked good. He's had a lot of bad games. He's been wholly unimpactful on, all of these series that he's played as a whole. It's just been a really bad look for Milky Way and for FPX. Like, he really has to prove that he even deserves to keep his spot on this team, let alone try to elevate them. Sheer had a couple of really bad games. I think the KDA is very misleading. Dway continues to be very active, but I don't think this is one of his better series. Overall, FPX played really bad, and I think AL, while they didn't play great, played, strong enough to be able to pick up the win. And at the end of the day, that's what really matters, is getting a win in the column. But at some point, this team has to figure out their form, because right now, the question marks that are surrounding anyone's legend are certainly not going away anytime soon. Then moving on now to day number 6, our first of the weekend days, and as you guys know by now, our super day here in the LPL, so 3 series on day number 6, and it kicked off with a matchup between Team WE and Bilibili Gaming, where Bilibili Gaming are going to pick up the 2-1 series win. This is expected. We thought that they were going to come in and win this series, but it's also not unexpected for them to drop a game, not only because BLG, theoretically is beatable. I don't think anybody's looking at this team and seeing some unbeatable monster in the same way that we saw some other teams, in previous splits, but also because WE just seems to love the formula of losing a series 1-2. It seems like they are addicted to picking up a win and not being able to do anything else in the series. So obviously it had to go this way, but jokes aside, obviously there are a lot of things to talk about when it comes to BLG's success in this series, and I think it really comes down to the fact that everybody is just playing so well on BLG right now. That starts and ends with Knight in the mid lane, in terms of just how he's able to control the map. I don't think he's even getting enough credit for how well he's playing right now, because I think he's doing a lot of the little things at such a high level. It's something he's always really been good at, is a lot of the things that people don't hype up, just lane control, not only winning in terms of his CS differential and his individual matchup, but making sure that the enemy mid laner has bad timers on when they can roam, lacking link up play between, Monkey and Karis, or at least intercepting it to make sure things like Hwei can't actually play the game. It's, really difficult for some of these matchups to end up functioning correctly if Knight does play super aggressive and plays with his jungle, and I think he's just doing all those things at a very high level right now. So really excited for Knight. It does seem like he's almost completely back into form. I would certainly not count him out for being an MVP guy across the rest of this split, especially considering the fact that BLG is undefeated right now. I imagine that will swing a lot of people's votes in that favor. But Shadow continues to be excellent for this team. There's only so much I can say about him that I haven't already said in this video and in previous videos. He's perfect stylistically for what they want to do, and I think his gameplay has been really effective. I think his pathing decisions are really strong. His aggressiveness in the early game, I think, has added a new level of confidence to BLG, and I think specifically he's been allowed to unlock On a bit more, which I think is really helpful. Now, On also made some terrible plays throughout this series. You can look at the Nico game in Game 2 and see a ton of problems with his gameplay, but at the end of the day, you're getting enough out of On, and most of the series before this have been terrific from him as a support that I'm willing to overlook some negative plays from a very aggressive support. Elk has been great across this split, one of the best AD carries in the entire league once again. Still waiting for him to get back into being the AD carry he was last year, which was, in my opinion, arguably the best in the entire world in terms of what he was putting out, but he's still been very good for this team. And then Bin continues his success on the top side. Had to be a little bit more weak side than maybe he's used to being, or at least he was in the previous series, so didn't quite get to build on that Yorick game nearly as much. But BLG just feel like they're clicking on all cylinders right now, which I'm obviously very excited for. And for WE, I'd love to be frustrated with them, but honestly, this was a pretty well-played series, all things considered, from them. Were they close in their 2 losses? Not particularly, but they definitely won Game 2. They were the better team by far in that, and it continues just to show exactly who WE is as a roster. It's Monkey being able to dominate one game in a series, stepping up and looking really good, and then in parts of the other games of the series, he looks really competent, and he'll make this back-breaking mistake. He did it again in game number 3. We talked about this so much last week when I gave him dud of the week for the entirety of the LPL. It's all well and good that you play great for the first 20 minutes of the game. If you make one horrible error at 21 minutes or 22 minutes or 15 minutes even at this point, then things really start to break down for the consistency of the roster, and that is the problem that Monkey is specifically running into in the jungle right now. He simply has to get better at being being able to clean up on a lot of those errors that he consistently is running into. But it's not just him. As much as I'd love to point to him and say, oh, he's playing so well and he's throwing things away, the fact that so much is on him is because the rest of this team is not stepping up in the same kind of way they were last split. This bot lane has regressed immensely. Taeyun is going to get done of the series. This is not the FPX series where he just gets to free farm and play Caitlyn and kind of dominate in the late game. He's actually having to go into a player in Elk that's going to try and push him in the early game, and it's not working out for Taeyun. I think what we're learning is just what we probably already knew all along. The fact that this guy is not going to be able to compete with the better AD carries in the world. He might be able to hold his own against AD carries that are not quite like super far above his mechanical skill level, but once you do reach kind of the tier above Taeyun mechanically speaking, he becomes unplayable. It's not like a lot of other AD carries that can lose gracefully. He is going to lose messily in terms of how the game breaks down, and we saw that in games 2 and 3. Vampire, I think, also had his own sets of problems once again in this series, even if on the other side also wasn't perfect. You know, Karis is not consistent in any way. Cube is not good on the top side. WE, I think, is just regressing back to the mean, and if you trust the talent level of this team and you trust that, you know, Monkey might be good, but the rest of the team might not be, then yeah, they're probably around the 8th or 9th best team in the LPL. That's fine, generally speaking, especially considering what the preseason expectations for them were, but they're not going to be competing to actually make the kind of impact they were able to in the spring split. Bilibili remains undefeated. They still look like they need to find that, you know, 3rd or 4th gear, but they've certainly hit, you know, a higher gear than they were at coming into the LPL, coming out of MSI. That is absolutely the case. This looks like the best version of the team so far this year, and I'm willing to go out on a limb and say that this is not a honeymoon phase thing for Shadow. This is actually just how good BLG is. Then moving on to our second series of day number 6, and this one was even easier to talk about. It's Weibo Gaming taking on Top Esports, and TES absolutely obliterates them. This really was not a close series at all. There were a couple of moments, credit Breathe and Tien, I think, who had times where they were pulling things back. You know, Xiaohu, I don't think, was a disaster in this series in the same kind of way that the bot lane was, but this was such a gap on the bottom side of the map that it honestly wasn't even worth, like, bringing up anything else in my notes. Most of my notes are just, man, Jackie loves way better than Light, huh? Like, Jackie loves the MVP frontrunner. Light's having the worst split of his entire career. Like, those are the notes from this series. If you want to take away, it's that the bot lane gap between Jackie Love and Hong and Light and Crisp is massive. And I think Weibo Gaming, if you didn't believe me, and I'll just do this as a small aside, if you didn't believe me last split or last year or 2 years ago when I was pretty vocal about the fact that Weibo Gaming is where supports go to die, do you believe me now? Like, is there anything else that's left to see? Because Top Esports was absolutely dominating with Crisp, and Hong looked like an unplayable LPL player when he was on the team. Crisp has always had his worst splits on Weibo Gaming. You have players like On that have also played their worst splits ever on Weibo Gaming. They just can't seem to find any consistency out of that position because of the way that they structure their games, and Top Esports exploited that. No one knows that better than Hong, and I think he definitely had a time here, but it's not him that's getting player of the series. How could I give it to anyone other than Jackie Love? The AD carry gap here was large. We'll just say that. You know, I've said a lot of things about Light across this year. Light has actually been a pseudo-channel darling, I would say, over the course of the past few years. Go back to like 2022, 2023 in particular, where I was just pounding the table for this guy over and over again as one of the most consistent and high-tier performing AD carries in the world. Not so much anymore in 2025, and part of that has to do with the fact that AD carries have just kind of come around and been a lot more consistent recently, specifically Jackie Love, who is on full-on MVP pace right now. This guy is decimating the league once again. Yunara, Sivir, I think the fact that we're getting back into a hyper carry meta where this guy can be the main character again might just be everything that Top Esports needs in order to win the league. That genuinely could be the difference between them being number 1 and number 3 in the power rankings, but Jackie Love being so good on these types of champions and being so aggressive in terms of the way that he wants to push a lot of the advantages he gets just makes him so impossible to stop at this level. Him and Hong have phenomenal chemistry together. Hong as an engager has been excellent because he's never overextending. He's really stable and safe in terms of the way that he creates plays, but he always is proactive. He's playing alongside Jackie Love. It's not the same thing that Jackie Love got off of even players like, you know, Mark and Mako back in the day. This is a completely different style, and I think you could argue this is working even better than what you were getting out of those more aggressive supports back in the day. So credit Hong, I think he's been playing great, but it really is just about the bot lane. Cream had a phenomenal week. If he can get back into form in the mid lane and really start becoming a top 3 mid in the LPL again, which is more than achievable for a player like Cream, if that's going to be a reality for him, Top Esports is going to be an upper tier team in the LPL. There's basically nothing that can stop them at that point if he's going to actually step up and start playing like that. I thought Kanavi played really well. Again, the KDA doesn't show it just like it didn't in the first series, but his early game pathing sets up everything that Top Esports does throughout every game that they play. 369 was fine, mostly weak side on the top side. Don't love the Yorick play, but at the end of the day, bot lane was so strong. Mid lane was really good. Jungle was even, a plus for Top Esports. It's just kind of clicking for this team. Them and Bilibili definitely feel like the big two right now. And for Weibo on the other side, as much as I like this roster and like this team, I think that there is a clear thing that's holding them back right now, and it's the lack of production coming in from the bot lane. Light has really not been good for this team. I know I've said it a lot over the course of this split, but it is really clear in a series like this that he is just outclassed by a lot of the top tier AD carries in the game right now, and it's really frustrating to watch. This guy had like 40 Senesouls at 20 minutes. Like, it was something ridiculous. It felt almost impossible for him to be doing that. He felt so uncomfortable on the champion. It was absurd. Like, it was unplayable, and quite frankly, Light has been like this for all of this year. Now it's gotten worse, I would say, going into summer than it was in the spring split, but I'm not going to back away or shy away from this idea that if he's not back into form soon, like very quickly, this team's not going to be able to figure it out, and they're not going to be competing to go to Worlds. They still are in the Big Five. I still think they're a part of that upper echelon, but if the bot lane's going to underperform with Crisp coming back and trying to get that stability back into the lineup, then it's going to be a disaster for them moving forward. I think you can look at Tien and his over-aggressiveness sometimes really coming back to bite the team. Breathe, I think, was, pretty solid. Xiaohu didn't really have any major mistakes, even if he was out-tempoed by Cream, but Weibo relies so much on a team effort, on an everybody stepping up and, kind of introducing their own piece to the puzzle and not one person carrying in that same kind of way, and that's just not the case right now for this team in a series like this. Bot lane was a disaster, and Top Esports took full advantage of it. Jackie level, like I said, is really on MVP, top 1 in the league type of pace, and if he's going to be able to keep that up, this team is going to be very difficult to stop. Then moving on to our third and final series of day number 6. Before we get into day 7, it was a matchup between LGD Gaming and Invictus Gaming, where IG picks up the 2-0 series win. Not too surprising considering where these teams are in terms of form right now, but certainly a good look for IG, who keeps their good form alive. I always get a bit worried every single time I start to feel good about Invictus or Weibo or even Top Esports, any of these teams in the LPL. That's when it feels like everything is destined to crash in terms of the regular season. Less so Top Esports. They seem to always get through the regular season and then figure out a way in the best of fives to fall apart. But Invictus, Weibo, like at some point in the regular season, they're going to crash out. They're just not going to be good forever. And I keep kind of having the breath held on me in terms of just whether or not it's going to happen right now. But IG continuing to pass every test that's thrown their way, at least in terms of being an upper tier team. Maybe they're not top 2, but top 3 I think is really achievable right now with AL struggling, and IG have put themselves in that conversation. JDG are just outside the top 5. Like, it's clear at this point, they are a tier of their own. They are below the top 5, and I think that they are better than everyone else in the LPL just in terms of the raw talent that they have. But this team is not going to compete to go to Worlds right now. They feel very, very much outside of that upper echelon. So let's go ahead and talk about it. For Invictus, player of the series is going to go to the Shy in the top lane. Get this guy on a tank, and he's going to take over. Excuse me? The Shyon gameplay looking incredible in game number 1. He was unkillable. Like, actually just was a huge problem throughout that entire game. And Ornn in game 2, the ultimates that he was able to drop and just generally the team fight impact he was able to have. The Shy doesn't often have games like this where he is completely fine in lane and then like ends up dominating in the late game. Typically speaking, you see the opposite. When the Shy ends up taking over, it's because he gets a really good start and he can, really snowball games very quickly. He has a good IQ for how to play from a lead and how to really like siphon energy from opponents. But, playing from neutral, not always something, I'm not saying he's bad from there. He's totally fine as a neutral player, but he's not usually like a superstar in that phase of the game. He absolutely was in this series, and I think that's really encouraging. I don't expect it to be something that lasts for the Shy. I hate to be kind of, Debbie Downer on that, but we kind of know who the Shy is as a player, at least in the regular season. I will say, I think IG being able to play a lot more through Gala and Rookie and Mako on the bottom side of the map does open up so many more options for the Shy to carry games, which I feel, maybe people won't think about. Maybe people will think, oh, Gala's just going to get more resources, so Gala will carry, but the Shy is going to get isolated more, I think, in 1v1s on the top side, where he can really thrive as a player. If you can take out the enemy team's ability to kind of target him in the early game and put him in a more disadvantageous position, he's really good at generating leads for himself. So expect maybe a really good second half from the Shy. I'm not quite sure that that's guaranteed to happen, but it's certainly something that could be on the board. Of course, the rest of the team was great. Mako is just on fire right now. Like, this guy is everything for their engage. This feels like 2024 Mako. We've been asking where this guy is. Well, he's shown up over the course of the past few series. He really has come alive, and I get it. It's Pays and Wink, who have been underperforming on the other side, but the laning, the team fighting, the skirmishing, all of it is back. Like, that's one of the things I really loved about Mako last year, is it felt he was the jack of all trades, master of all kind of player, and it really does feel like he's starting to get back into that kind of form where you can look at every part of the Alistar or the Nico gameplay and see huge positives. For Gala, he ends up playing phenomenal outside of his 2 deaths. If you ignore the 2 horrible plays that he made throughout this series that ended up being really funny to watch, he was basically perfect. Like, 95% success rate is still pretty damn good for an AD carry, and in those fights, he was so much better than Pays. It really does feel like Gala's starting to get his feet under him. We saw bits and pieces of this in the spring split, much more so than people will give him credit for, but it's really unlocked now. And again, Wei and Rookie, the last players we're bringing up, the players that really did so much for this team at the beginning of the split. Wei was awesome in game 1 on the Skarner, was setting everything up, and Rookie completely gapped Scout in the mid lane. It's just all working for Invictus. This is clearly one of the better teams in the LPL. And for JD Gaming on the other side, man, is it not looking good. Like, it is collapsing down around them in terms of how things are going. This jungle mid duo was terrible in this series. Bot lane has given up. Top lane is not even that big of a positive, although, the best part of the team right now, which is not expected, but Shun and Scout looked awful across week 4. They have to figure something out. Scout is getting yet another dud of the series. What else do I even need to say about Scout at this point? It's been very well documented that this guy's performance over the past couple of months has been terrible. I understand all the memes surrounding the fact that he's blackmailing the team into playing him and yada, 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 all this stuff. Crazy enough, I believe in Scout to be able to figure things out. There have been players in this mid lane position that have had this same kind of arc where it feels completely cooked, where it feels completely done, and then they figured it out and come back. Rookie at times has looked like that. I think Top Esports Rookie very much is a great example of a player that looked cooked and, figured it out and ended up getting back on track. Last year, Xiaohu, I think, was a really good example of this, a player who was absolutely miserable for a large portion of 2024 and ended up, leveling up just enough in time to get his team to Worlds. Like, it is possible for Scout to figure things out, but when I compare him to Larson, I didn't mean it for it to be so literal. He's literally doing nothing and losing. He's walking in to traps set by the jungler that he knows are there, and it's bad gameplay. It feels like he's mentally checked out. It feels like he's not adapting well to the modern meta. It just feels really bad for Scout. He's not generating leads. Like, everything is going wrong. Everything that could go wrong is going wrong for Scout in the mid lane. And then you've got Shun in the jungle, who just had the worst week he's ever had, maybe in league history, like maybe on his former org, Invictus Gaming, maybe he had some, series like this every once in a while where he would be really bad before he broke out as a star on BLG. But ever since he became like a really good player, I can't remember a time where he was so thoroughly outclassed across an entire week. This was a really bad showcase from Shun. He needs to get back into form. I get that Scout and Pays and, Wink, they're not helping you out right now. Like, it feels impossible to be able to carry some of these performances, but he's got to at least try, or at least show some flashes, because this team is completely doomed if he starts to fall off. Pays, I've already talked about, has played really poor. I think he was better earlier this week. I think this was another weak series from him. Him and Wink have no chemistry. It feels like they are just negative as a bot lane duo. For as bad as Missing was, at the very least, Pays felt comfortable playing with him in the support position. Wink feels like a complete downgrade to this team from a player that was already losing them games. And Xiaoshu is an upgrade on the top side. He's been better than Ala. I think that is very clear, but the Shy was better than Xiaoshu in this series, and the rest of the team fell apart. So JD Gaming just don't really have anything going for them right now. They are a clear, top 6 team and not anywhere near the top 5. And for Invictus, they might be top 3. This genuinely could be one of the best teams in the LPL, and they have the kind of upside that could be even better than that. If this team is in finals, I don't think anybody's really going to be all that shocked at this point. But that's going to bring us to our 7th and final day of action here in the LPL in week number 4, and I did cast this day, so again, it hopefully will be a bit quicker as we end this video. Our first series of the day was a matchup between Thunder Talk Gaming and Edward Gaming, where Edward Gaming, EDG, are going to pick up the 2-1 series win. Couple of notable things to take away from this. EDG stay undefeated in series score, but do lose their first game of the split in game number 1. I figured it would be Ninjas in Pyjamas or even like a sneaky LGD type of victory. I didn't think it was going to be Thunder Talk, who ended up, taking EDG's first game of the split, but at the end of the day, anything can happen in a best of 1. That's why that format is terrible, cough, cough, North America, but obviously, game 2, game 3, very much in favor of EDG. They were the better team in this series, even if they tried not to be. 1xN had pluses and minuses. Again, we'll talk about it because the formula stays the same for Thunder Talk, and I don't think there's a ton to say on their front that is any different than what we've already talked about about across this video already. But for EDG in particular, boy did ZDZ play out of his mind in this series. Is this not the best he's played in years? I know he has random series like this every once in a while. In fact, I cast one of them in the previous split. It feels like maybe I'm the blessing towards ZDZ's game in terms of how things end up breaking down, but what a great performance from him on the Aatrox, where he ends up getting a quadra kill and becomes completely unkillable down the stretch of that game, and on the Mbessa, where he hits some crucial ultimates in the back half of the game to really salvage everything for EDG. You know, these games could have gotten dicey, but ZDZ was so much better than Hoya on the other side of this matchup that it ended up being fine. At times, and it's not just at times, I've actually gone very far in claiming that ZDZ only has a job in the LPL because of Xiaohao, because of the fact that Xiaohao keeps bringing him along to every single team that he plays for, and by proxy, he ends up winning despite the fact that he's not playing particularly well in the top lane. Well, here you go. Here's the type of performance that gives you the confidence that he can still be an LPL caliber top laner. Do I think he's going to be able to do this consistently? No, he has never been able to do this consistently over the course of his career, but they brought the ZDDs out in chat for this one because he played great. I think it is worth pointing out Palkia in this series because as bad as some of his engages were, and game 1 was terrible, the Alistar was awful, and as questionable as some of the Nautilus or Leona engages were in games 2 or 3, he has completely revamped the identity of what this team is. He might be the most aggressive support in the entire world. Like, there is genuinely an argument that there is nobody who likes engaging more than Palkia in the support position, and that makes things pretty fun to watch for EDG, and I think it does back up some of the gameplay of the rest of this team. Do I think that that will work against good teams? Absolutely not. I think that that will get incredibly punished by a lot of the best teams in the league if they do end up making it into the playoffs, but for now, he's basically turning every single game into a hands check, which EDG absolutely can win against any other team in Group Nirvana. I gotta pump up Xiaohao at least a little bit because that's just how this channel goes. I don't think this was one of his best series. Unfortunate that I had to cast one of the only series this split where he's kind of just been more of a background member, but he still was fine. He was landing the smites, and that's all that really mattered. I think he won 4 50-50s across this series, which is insane. And then Angel was also good in the mid lane. Definitely kind of, you know, put another good foot forward, I would say. On was much better on the Jhin in game 3 than he was on the other champs, especially the Corki in game 1. But EDG looking solid. Like, I want to say this is their weakest showing of the split up until this point, but they still end up winning 2-1. That's just how dominant this team has been so far, so not really a ton to complain about. And then for Thunder Talk on the other side, I really want to keep this segment short because literally copy and paste what I said in their 2 series against Ninjas in Pyjamas, where, you know, 1xN looks pretty good in game number 1. They get him on a hyper carry, this time the Smolder. They get him a ton of stacks early in the game, and he's just able to carry it. Then they force him to play something else, in this case the Aphelios and Varus in games 2 and 3, and even though those champions are strong and fit into the identity of how Thunder Talk want to play the game, they weren't given a free lane in terms of how things broke down, so they weren't able to win. The rest of this team is just not good enough to elevate anyone. It's 1xN or bust in terms of how these games end up going down. Satab continues to be horrible. In the mid lane, he played the Ahri just about as bad as anybody has ever played, but Aki is going to be the one getting dud of the series for me because I think you can look at both the Xin Zhao and the Nocturne game and see a bunch of negatives on top of the fact that he couldn't land a smite to save his life the entire series. Just a lot going wrong, but the jungle mid was atrocious. You can, you know, no spoilers, but you can bet that one of them is going to be dud of the week in terms of how things end up panning out with just how bad they were across week 4. Hoya also continues to just be a complete pushover on the top side. The games that he wins are few and far between, and when every single top laner is having their best series against Thunder Talk, you do have to start wondering what the commonality between those examples is, and unfortunately that is Hoya. Feather, I think, also is really starting to regress back to what he was the previous split, which is not a bad player, but certainly a more inconsequential one when it comes to the game as a whole. Not really a lot to add for Thunder Talk, just not a very good team and a team that I think is consistently getting worse. And for Edward Gaming on the other side, they have to be able to win Nirvana. Right now, they are looking incredibly scary. They're looking like a playoff team more than, you know, stabilized at that point. They're a top 7 team, at least from my perspective, and top 6 is not out of the realm of possibility with a team like LGD Gaming completely underperforming, but they have to keep this level of form up. This was the first crack in the armor in game number 1. We'll see how they respond next week. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here, and it was a series we just talked about. We're running over series already, the second repeat series of the week. It's Team WE once again taking on Bilibili Gaming in back-to-back days, nonetheless, and Bilibili Gaming is once again going to win 2-1, and they once again are going to drop game number 2. You know, it feels like a time loop. It feels like we're just stuck here, but definitely some different things to talk about in terms of how this series broke down. More risks coming in from both of these teams, both for good and for bad, but really really, I think the main takeaways are the same. Game number 1 was basically run by BLG, at least in terms of the consistency. Taeyun was in a spot to be able to potentially win it on the Corki, but just didn't have enough firepower to actually make it happen. The comp in the late game for BLG was simply too strong. Their front to back was too good, and they were able to control objectives too well. And then in game 2, they just trolled completely. Like, the Zed was entirely unplayable, and Monkey took over on Olaf. Great. Like, this is an Olaf game where if he gets fed, there's not really a lot you can do. This is one of the few exceptions where I think Yorick is actually super valuable. That being said, I said it on broadcast, I'll say it again here. I think BLG's draft is fine because you have Azir and Sivir, and you should be able to just fight basically 4v5 in the back half of the game with the damage that you have. You just can't allow Olaf to get fed in the early game, and that's exactly what ended up happening. But game 3, I mean, what a weird game to talk about. A game that was over at 5 minutes. It was literally, what, a 3k gold deficit for WE at 6 minutes into the game because it was dive after dive after dive from on the Nico, and yet somehow, some way, WE tried to fight their way back into it with Monkey getting resets on the Viego and, you know, generally Vampire having some aggressive engages, most going poorly, but some going well, and then BLG shut the door on that with one good team fight in the back half of the game. Cube was a nightmare, and things end. Like, that's kind of the takeaway from this series in terms of big narrative storylines. There's not a lot that's changed from the previous day in terms of what I already talked about with these two teams, so I might be even a bit shorter than normal in that front, but On is going to get player of the series because the entirety of game number 3 was centered around that Nico. In the early game, she was just constantly transforming into a minion, and they were being able to execute dives at an incredibly high frequency. I think it was 4 dives in the first 10 minutes of the game, and all of them ended up being successful in some way, shape, or form. But even if you fail 1 or 2, which they did later on in that game, you know, if you're going to succeed on 4 or 5 dives and fail on 1, that's a crazy positive success rate for the team. And that's something that, you know, teams who are really good at playing around Nico can, you know, execute on. Of course, once you start hitting level 6, it becomes even more efficient to play around the Nico, so it becomes very easy there. Elk ends up getting crazy fed on the Tristana, and he can start taking over in a lot of the late game team fights. But the Cassio, the Sejuani, the Renekton, all of it was just positive for BLG in that final game, even if they didn't necessarily show it in some of those fights. Some bad ultimates from Shadow, some bad timings from Bin on engages. You know, there were some things they needed to clean up, but playing around On was really the main one. I think the only other thing I can talk about is that Knight technically got player of the game in game 1. That was ridiculous. That absolutely should have gone somewhere else, basically anywhere else. I think Elk got robbed on the Xayah, but, you know, to each their own. Bilibili was just pretty solid here. Not really a lot of different narrative takeaways. Knight was still great in this series. I'm not trying to rag on him in any way, shape, or form. But for WE on the other side, oh my goodness, was this series winnable if they did not have Cube in the top lane. Cube might have just played the worst top lane game I've seen in a very long time, and it's funny because we've been talking across this video so far about just how good of a week this was for a lot of top laners across the LPL. Cube did not get the memo. He apparently was not informed that this was supposed to be a week where top laners ended up performing well because he sold game number 3 on the Ornn after having a really good Yorick game in game 2 where he did exactly what he needed to do, which was essentially buy time and pull BLG away from all of their main objectives. You know, buy time for the rest of the team to basically do whatever they want. Either create a 5v4 situation where, you know, BLG have to lose their whole base, or, you know, pull somebody to Cube and, you know, WE always win the 4v4. That was a great Yorick game. To play that Ornn game in game 3, to miss every ultimate, like actively miss. I'm not saying like, oh, we only hit the tank or whatever. Like, to actively hit 0 people with the Ornn Horn every single fight, and to be caught out every single fight, to get dove over and over again, and to step too far forward and actively lose your team the game. It's just, it's miserable stuff from Cube, and this was a really bad week, all things considered, for him. But it wasn't just him. Vampire had some miserable engages in this series. Now, don't get me wrong, he had some phenomenal ones as well, and I think that's what people are going to latch onto, was the good plays, because there were some really good plays, but the bad plays have to be acknowledged at the very least. Taeyun's positioning is criminally terrible. Karis is just not a good mid laner, and Monkey is having to 1v9 most of these games. Olaf, Viego, these are the kinds of things I want to see him play significantly more of, because the team is entirely in his hands. If he has the chance to carry, they always have the chance to win. That is just the case for WE. But again, the narrative is not shifting here. This is still one of the weaker teams in Group Ascend, and BLG is still better than them, but WE just took 2 games out of 6 off of BLG. That's not a bad, you know, turn of events. 50% of BLG's losses are to Team WE now, but at the end of the day, they still ended up picking up the win in the series, and game 3 really was not close. It ended up being close because WE fought back, but this was not a game that was remotely contestable, and so, you know, BLG, you know, for all their flaws, are still a team that I'm expecting to, right now, be at the top of the LPL. Alright, but that is going to do it for my LPL Week 4 overview and analysis video up on the screen. The updated standings after 4 weeks of action. We've got quite a few interesting things to look at the very least, in terms of the Ascend and Nirvana standings. One team has already locked their spot, themselves, into play-ins here in Group Nirvana, that of course being Edward Gaming. You can see highlighted in green. Even WE and FPX haven't done that up in Group Ascend, so credit to the undefeated Edward Gaming, but you'll kind of see how I expect them to fare in those play-ins in the power rankings column to the right of every single team. Change is going to be how that has changed from last week to this week, and we can go over risers and fallers. Really not a lot of changes in my power rankings, things kind of going according to plan for the most part across this week, but the top of the power rankings are very different. AL falling all the way down to number 4 in my power rankings. At this point, there's really nothing else that I can do here. Until they prove that they are a team that can compete with the top 3, they can't be there. They lost to Invictus, very clearly, and they've not been nearly as good as BLG and Top Esports. If they had beaten Invictus, but maybe lost to, other teams kind of around there in skill level, like lost to Top Esports, I maybe would still have them around number 2 or something like that. But the fact that they're losing to all 3 and that Tarzan is a big, piece of the puzzle that is not working for the team does give me a lot of pause. Until they prove they are top 3 again, they will move down to number 4. Everybody else moves up a spot, but I think they've deserved it at this point. BLG undefeated is going to stay at number 1, although I think Top Esports is right on their tail in terms of how 1 and 2 are going. I think they are 2 of the best teams right now in terms of actual production in the entire world. Now, will they be able to keep that up? You never really know when it comes to LPL teams, but those are the top 2 teams in the LPL, and Invictus is a clear number 3, but definitely at number 3 in terms of where they're at, especially with their really good run of form as of late. Weibo will stay at number 5. I think this is a good team. I just think they're struggling because they're only going up against upper tier teams. JDG is really struggling, but they still are number 6, and then you get to the Edward Gaming, so I think can still go up, but their 1 game loss to Thunder Talk did give me a bit of pause, putting them above a team like JDG, even though it is in the back of my mind right now. WE is going to stay at 8. NIP is going to stay at 9, although I very much considered putting NIP above WE. I think it's a pretty reasonable thing to expect to say that Ninjas and Pyjamas right now is better than Team WE, but 8 and 9 I think is kind of up for debate. I still think FPX is a top 10 team. I think they're good enough to be able to compete, but Milky Way has clearly made this team at the very least more volatile, if you even want to say they're not just straight up worse than what they were with IYY, as bad as IYY was at times. FPX is just not clicking, and 1 and 6 I think is a clear indicator of that, losing to a team like Team WE this week, and then everybody else is just kind of in their own order. One thing of note, Thunder Talk will be staying at 12 because I still believe they're going to be fine against LNG and Ultra Prime, but if they end up not being fine against LNG and Ultra Prime, expect this team to tumble down the power rankings quickly. They are in the real danger zone of not even making it to the play-ins because you need to be top 4 in Group Nirvana to do so. So those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comment section below, but let's go ahead and get into my player of the week and my dud of the week for week number 4. Player of the week for me is going to go to Mako, the support for Invictus Gaming. He's really looking like he's back. I'm not going to sit here and say that he definitely is back or that nothing is wrong with Mako and that every game he plays is going to be like 2024 Top Esports Mako again, but I am saying that it looked like that this week in week number 4. 4 games played, in all 4 of them he was a really big deal, specifically on the Alistair against both AL and JD Gaming, but the Rel game as well I think was terrific. Mako deserves a lot of praise for why IG's form has gotten so consistent. Hopefully he's going to be able to keep it up. He was not this good even nearly in the spring split, so if he is going to be this good in summer, that is a huge turn of form for an IG team, not only hoping to make Worlds, but hoping to actually make some impact in the LPL. And then my honorable mentions, Jackie Love, the AD carry for Top Esports, continues to really push his MVP case forward. We're halfway through the split. He is definitely the front runner right now. And then Knight, the mid laner for BLG. If Jackie Love is leading the MVP race, Knight is very much in second place in terms of how things are going. Both of these two have been incredibly important towards their team's success, and that was definitely on display in week 4. But my dud of the week, pretty obviously, is going to go to Satab, the mid laner for Thunder Talk. Boy, was this team a disaster across this entire week. It had to go to one of the 2 jungle mid duo players for TT. I thought Aki was a tad bit more consistent. Satab was just horrible throughout the entire week, so he's the one who ends up getting it. But there were actually quite a few candidates in the LPL this week, including a very sneaky Tarzan that I think could have potentially gotten a nod for Dud of the Week, but I ended up landing on Satab for Dud of the Week and Mako for Player of the Week. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We don't only cover the LPL on this channel, although we will cover it every single week, and I will keep casting as I announced at the beginning of this video, but we also cover the LTA North, the LEC, and the LCK every single week. We also cover the NACL Tier 2 over in North America every week, so if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But With all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all